Hi, welcome back to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graban. Our guest today is Minette Norman. She is an author, speaker, and leadership consultant who previously spent decades leading global technical teams in the software industry. So Minette has extensive experience leading internationally distributed teams and believes that when groups embrace diversity in all its forms, breakthroughs emerge and innovation accelerates. So her most recent position before starting her consultancy was as vice president of engineering practice at Autodesk. So Minette now is a keynote speaker on inclusive leadership, psychological safety, collaborative teams, and empathy. She was named in 2017 as one of the most influential women in Bay Area business by the San Francisco Business Times and as Business Role Model of the Year in the 2018 Women in IT Silicon Valley Awards. Minette is author of the book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, and she's co-author of the book, The Psychological Safety Playbook. So Minette, thank you for being here on the podcast. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
I've been enjoying the Psychological Safety Playbook, and there's a lot to talk about. It's a topic that comes up frequently here in the podcast. I'm excited to hear your perspectives and tips. But if psychological safety includes feeling safe to share and admit mistakes, I hope you feel safe to share your favorite mistake.
Yeah, and when I knew I was going to be on this podcast, I started thinking about all the mistakes, including the cringeworthy and the appalling, and I just came back to favorite. And so I like the word favorite because this one that I'm going to share is something that really changed my thinking and helped me move forward in an important way. So this story goes back to when I was still in tech, when I was at Autodesk. I was a mentor to many, many people. Over the years, I had grown through my career and I felt it was really important to give back. And one of the ways I did that was through mentorship. So I had a number of mentees. And there was this one mentee that I had been working with for a while. She was a young woman, probably 20, 25 years younger than I am. And she was always really enthusiastic. Like she would come into my office for our mentoring meetings, full of energy, excited to tell me what she was working on, like what her successes had been, what her challenges had been. And so one day she came into my office and I could just immediately feel that the energy was different. There was not the exuberance, not the bubbly feeling of, let me tell you what's going on. So as I started, listening to what was going on with her, she explained that she was in a really difficult situation with her leaders. And to me, as I was hearing it, it sounded like bullying, potentially harassment, all of my radar was up when I was hearing what was going on with her. And after she told me the full story, my immediate reaction was, you have to report this to HR, because I really felt there was something deeply wrong going on. And, either I had to do it or she had to do it. As soon as I said those words, she got this look. I mean, it was one of those micro expressions that I saw go across her face, and it was terror. And I said, what's going on here? You don't like that suggestion I just made? And she said, no. And she said, I cannot risk reporting a situation like this, potentially facing retaliation, potentially losing my job because I'm here on a visa and I am waiting for my green card. And I'm stuck. She basically said, I'm stuck and I cannot afford to lose my job. And so even though I'm in a situation that's making me deeply unhappy right now, I need to write it out either until I get the green card or another job that's going to sponsor my visa. And why that stuck with me so much. And it was my assumption coming from my perspective of, we need to report this, right? This is wrong. And all that's true. However, I needed to step into her seat and realize that not everyone's experiencing the world as I do. There I was in my position of privilege of being a U.S. citizen and not needing to worry about visas and green cards. And here was this woman I'd been mentoring, and that is top of mind for her. She can't lose her job. She could lose the ability to work in this country. And what it did is that it just made me realize we never know what's going on with someone else because we're always seeing things through our lenses. And this is the opportunity to get curious. This is why we need to try to strengthen our empathy. No, they're not all going through what we're going through. They're going through something different. And I feel like it was a turning point for me in making assumptions, in just understanding that people are living living the work experience very differently than I am.
Mm.
And so it's up to me not to impose my viewpoints, but really understand where they're coming from.
Wow. So it's a powerful story. It's sad to hear that protections that you think would be in the workplace or legal protections for anybody, or particularly a woman in that position, or maybe not protecting somebody as much as we would hope. I'm sure, naive and privileged about this from my own perspective here.
Well, I was naive then too, because I thought this is what we do. We need to share this with HR. And then several years later, I had my own experience with this, and I found out that I really was naive, because I didn't even intend to tell this story, but here's another one, which is that I got into a situation where I got a new leader who bullied me. And it was documented as bullying. People reported it. There was an investigation. And unfortunately, what happened was I was given the choice of report to the bully or leave. And that is when I left tech.
Yeah. Was that, did that come down to be a relatively easy choice, or was that really something that you were struggling through, much as your mentee had struggles, or you had more options maybe?
So I certainly had a lot of options. I mean, financially, I was in a situation where I could take time and figure out what I wanted to do. I didn't have a visa situation. Honestly, I had tons of privilege there. However, that didn't mean that it was easy, because I will say it was devastating after a really long and successful career to have it end that way. And also I kept, maybe this is another mistake, like maybe another favorite mistake here. I know you only asked for one,
No,
but
it's okay. No.
maybe I kept thinking I could fix things. I kept thinking, I have managed to work through hard things before. I can make this work. And what I was naive about is that the leaders were ready for me to leave. I just was no longer what they wanted in the role, and they didn't want me anywhere else in the company. And it might have been because I was challenging the status quo a lot, and they weren't to. So basically, I wasn't ready to leave, and it forced my hand. And why that's a favorite mistake about my own naivete and being forced out is that it forced me to figure out, what do I want to do next, and led me to this work on writing and speaking in my new career. But it's not to underestimate and minimize how painful it was at the time.
Yeah. Is that the type of thing? I don't know if this is fair to ask, but I mean, is it the type of thing where you pursue possible legal avenues for the situation of feeling or being bullied and forced out?
Yeah, well, I certainly consulted with an attorney, and I got that's where I got a big education in what really goes on in these situations, and also how, unfortunately, this is so sad, but how common it is. Because once I went through it, I learned of so many other people who've gone through similar things. What I learned from the lawyers is that if you pursue legal action, any company is going to come out and try to find people to defame your character. Anyone who wants to say anything bad about you from your whole career will be brought out. And so it's a question of, do you have the fortitude to go through that? And I certainly didn't. I was not interested in that. I needed to move on. Yeah.
And I'm glad you were able to do so and pursue other things. I mean, you're making me think of, and this is all, of course, I think very interconnected into concepts of psychological safety, and that there's probably overlap. So I'll just ask it. Overlap with your book, not just the psychological safety playbook, but the boldly inclusive leader. I think one thing I've learned, I think not because I made any huge mistake, but my mistake was not realizing that trying to tell people in different circumstances that you should speak up is quite often unfair.
Yeah.
And that, I think of like working a lot in healthcare, there's I think a fairly common situation where somebody lower in the professional hierarchy, and that hierarchy causes a lot of problems. Classic case would be a nurse in an operating room who's aware of bad behavior or risks committed by a powerful surgeon. I've heard some people even in nursing circles say, like, well, as a nurse, it's your professional obligation to speak up, but at the expense of their paycheck or their home, or like, the risk that they lose their job is real.
Yeah.
And I think unfair to say, well, good people speak up. I'm like, well, no, it's more complicated than that.
Oh, and it's true. It's true. I mean, I know that the stakes are incredibly high in a medical setting, and it's also true in other settings. And this is where I really understood the concept of psychological safety and learned about it, was in tech. And it was so common for us not to speak up. And there were so many reasons. And I remember one time, I was a VP and I was sitting on the senior staff, and the SVP was complaining. He's like, why don't people tell me things? Why don't people speak up? They're not, and he's like wondering, like, in good faith, like, why don't people speak up? And his premise was that they're not, he's like, they're afraid of losing their job. Mm-hmm. And what ensued was a really interesting discussion, because it goes much farther than losing your job. Because in many cases, no, you're not going to lose your job. However, the consequences are real. You will be marginalized. You will be not given that plum assignment. You will not be considered for the promotion or whatever it is, because you're considered difficult or a troublemaker. Mm-hmm. So reputational damage is much of it. And then you also look at privilege, and you look at who is allowed to speak up and who is punished for speaking up. And it's often, the people in the inner, this is where I really started to understand the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, and who's in the inner circle and who's not. And those sort of dominant personalities who are closest to the higher leader, right? Those are the ones who can say anything and get away with it. And then there are the people with distance from that sort of power and hierarchy who are not free to speak up in the same way, because they will get the eye roll, or they will be embarrassed, or they will be ignored, or they just will be like, oh, there she goes again. And that takes a long-term toll on people. And what I remember, like, because I was a woman in a highly male-dominated field, I often felt like, okay, if I'm going to speak up, I need to prepare incredibly well and say something very well thought out and very intelligent, and not just the first thing that comes to mind. Whereas I think others felt more comfortable just speaking off the cuff. So there are many reasons people don't speak up, and the ramifications are real.
Yeah. And what's sad sometimes, though, is even within a senior leadership team, not everybody reporting to the CEO feels that ability to challenge the status quo, or to disagree, or to speak up. I mean, I would agree. Generally speaking, the higher you are in the organization, the more safety there might be. But sadly, that's not always true. I've heard stories, from a health system. I wasn't there, so I can't say it was true. But rumor was that the CFO disagreed with the CEO in a meeting and got fired, pretty much on the spot, for like being insubordinate. Like, stuff like that spreads, and think about how that story trickles down through a culture.
Yeah. I have a story that I tell in the Boldly Inclusive Leader, and it's about psychological safety. And it was one that marked me, not only me, but everyone who witnessed it. So what happened was, we were in a senior leadership meeting. It was all the people at the VP and above, and it's like 100 people for this annual gathering. And our CEO was holding a Q&A session and said, now's the time to ask me anything. And so people were asking questions, and I raised my hand and I asked what I thought was a completely fair question. And he got super defensive, and he yelled at me in front of all of my peers, basically shutting me down and saying that's an inappropriate question. First of all, I was really publicly humiliated. But what happened, to your point about like, what are the ramifications of that happening? Those other 99 people in the room all witnessed what happened. No one was going to raise their hand again.
Right.
That has not only far-reaching but long-lasting impact, because it's like, oh, he just said, ask me anything, but he doesn't really mean it. That's what we've taken away from that, right?
Right. Whether it was intentional or just an inability to control his reaction, he made an example out of you.
Exactly. And, later apologized and said, I got defensive and all that. I'm like, that's why I have actually in both books, there are whole chapters about managing that instinctive defensive reaction, because it's one of the most destructive things leaders can do is to not get a handle on when they're triggered.
So there's some connections maybe to emotional intelligence.
Yes,
And
completely. self-awareness, emotional intelligence. I think all of this goes hand in hand with creating a safe and inclusive environment. And it comes down to leadership behavior so much of the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, we've used this phrase and we've talked about it in other episodes, Minette, but I want to give you an opportunity, as co-author of the Psychological Safety Playbook, for a listener who maybe is wondering, well, what is the best definition, or how do you define psychological safety?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because like we
Because I think
assume all sorts of things and
there's some
people are
misunderstandings.
probably interpreting it. So psychological safety is a belief that in a group you are a part of, you can ask a question, you can make a mistake, you can disagree with someone else in the room, knowing you will not be marginalized, you will not be excluded, and there will not be negative ramifications.
Yeah.
And the thing that I want to point out is that it is at a group level. And so like you can't really talk about psychological safety for an entire organization, because that organization, let's say it's 1,000 people, it's full of little groups.
Right.
And each group has its own dynamics and its own level of psychological safety. So like we were just talking about this senior leadership team, that is a group that meets regularly and that interacts regularly. That group will have its own level of psychological safety, and then a project team will have a different one. So I think that's an important thing to remember. It's not like between two people, it's really at a group level.
Would you agree that, and thank you for defining that, because I think that checks the boxes of definitions I've heard of, like, do you feel safe to speak up, or how safe do you feel to speak up without that risk or threat? Would you agree, because this is at a group level, that our sense of psychological safety is very situational?
Yes, completely. And it has to do, it's also twofold. It has to do with the group dynamics, of course, and it also has to do with what we bring ourselves and the baggage we have and maybe the damage that has been. Like, if I am someone who was shut down in a recent meeting, I may just by nature feel really unsafe because I'm a little scarred, versus someone who's been part of this group and hasn't had that experience. So I think it's the group and then the individuals and what we each bring to that interaction.
Yeah. And, that senior leadership team, or a senior leadership team, hopefully has built good relationships and rapport and trust. But I could see where, somebody who feels that way within their software development team, with their colleagues, with their leader. Now, if you were to suddenly, put them into a new team, and, they have a reputation of, so-and-so is not afraid to speak their mind. Well, being thrown into a new situation might now be kind of newly scary. And I think that's understandable. It's not a reflection on the individual, right?
Exactly. And when you come into a new situation, for most people, the instinct is, okay, let me sit back and watch and learn before I put myself out there. I need to see how the dynamics are here. So yeah, exactly. It's entirely situational and group based. Yeah.
So let me ask you this first. Why is psychological safety so important? How do you articulate that beyond being nice, or, I'm going to use a phrase of like, oh, it's the right way to treat people. That may all well be true, but how do you articulate the reasons why this is so important?
Yeah, and that's not. I think what's important is that we are not aiming for psychological safety because it feels good or because it's an end unto itself. It really is an enabler of so many things that are important to every business or nonprofit or whatever, because what it enables when you have this foundation of psychological safety, first of all, it enables higher performance, because when people feel safe, they can bring up the real things, and so maybe solve problems more quickly, address issues, not be afraid to say, like, we have a risk here, so that performance increases. What also increases, and again, there's lots of great literature to back this up, so I'm just sharing the high ideas, but high level ideas. Innovation goes up, and you can understand this because if you have a group of people and everyone feels welcome to share their ideas, even if they're wildly out there, you might just hear that groundbreaking, innovative idea that you need. So innovation for sure goes up, performance goes up. And then I guess maybe one third idea of why it's so important to have psychological safety. Employee engagement, motivation, and well-being all go up when people feel safe. And the opposite of that is people are suffering when they don't have it because they can't speak up. They don't feel welcome. They're experiencing pain on a daily basis for not having that safety. So I think even if you just think about it like, oh yeah, it's kumbaya, it feels good. No, that's not why we're doing it. It's higher performance, better innovation, and employee well-being and retention and all of those things.
Yeah. Well, and I think those benefits do go hand in hand. So
yes.
I'm glad you highlight the impact on well-being, mental health, physical health, people's home or family lives if they're taking that stress
exactly
with them. I mean, it impacts the ripple effects of an environment where people are being punished for speaking up. I mean, it's hard to estimate.
Oh yeah, and that you're right. It trickles into our I think there's that other thing that we think that we leave our home life at home when we go to work, and that we leave our work life when we come home. It all impacts us, right? And so if people are feeling like I am not, like my ideas are not welcome, I can't do my best work, of course that's going to permeate in their personal lives.
Yeah. So, favorite topic of this podcast, of course, mistakes. And you touched on part of the definition of feeling safe to admit mistakes. But there's a whole section in the book. You touched on this earlier about managing your reactions.
Yes.
And your emotions. What are your thoughts around helping leaders react to mistakes in a way that's more helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a huge piece, and honestly, I think I work with a lot of different organizations now as a consultant and speaker, and one of the things I found that in most places, speaking about failure and mistakes is still a little taboo in most places, or it's not commonplace to actually say like we're going to talk about failures and mistakes openly. I think what leaders can do, I mean, first of all, we have to admit that we ourselves as leaders are not infallible, that we make mistakes. And we have to very much set the example to be able to talk about like something that didn't go well in my world this week, being able to share what I learned. And so to reframe mistakes as learning opportunities. Now, Amy Edmondson she has a whole new book on, right kind of wrong and different kinds of failures and mistakes. And it doesn't mean that I think here's the misconception that when we talk about this is like every mistake is okay and we should celebrate it. No, I mean, they're preventable failures that should be prevented. They're just like carelessness. So that's not what we're talking about. But what we're talking about, if you're going to innovate, and I think this is where people start to understand it, innovations do not come without failure, right? I mean, you don't just get it on the first try when you're trying to do something totally new. And so to try to, first of all, acknowledge that from the get-go, that we don't innovate without failure. What we want to do is learn. And we want to learn more quickly and not like invest a year's worth of work and then fail, but iterate and learn as we go and go like, okay, this hypothesis is not turning out the way we thought. Let's go back and be public about it, and that there's no shame in that. So I think we remove the shame, we remove the blame, we get really curious to learn together and to explore, what did we learn? What are we going to do differently? What do we keep doing that's working? And that leaders set the tone for this by being able to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and starting with themselves. Really, they so much have to lead by example. Like, as you said, like just saying, speak up, right? That doesn't work. People don't believe it's safe, but also, it's safe to fail. Well, do you believe it if the leader has never, ever shared a failure of their own? Probably not, right?
Right. And maybe you're working with a group where, it's a self-selecting sample of people who are interested in these topics and willing to roll up their sleeves or look in the mirror or do the work or however you want to put it. But I mean, maybe even in those organizations, here's the question, I guess. How often do you find a leader at some level of the organization who's either unwilling or unable to start admitting mistakes if they've got decades of old habit?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's really common, of course. And I think it's because, the models of leadership that we've had for probably more than a century are that leaders are all-knowing, they are powerful. There's no chink in the armor there, right? And that's still so much of what leaders think how they need to show up. And of course, I'm trying to work to change that. But yes, it's very common. And there's a lot of resistance, even when they say like I know this is important,
Mm-hmm.
but, and then the big but is, but I think I'm going to be viewed as weak, or I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
be viewed as incompetent, right? And there's so much needing to show and prove and constantly prove time and time again our competence as leaders. And so
Yeah.
trying to separate that, the competence versus, well, we're all works in progress and we're all learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy. And especially, I think the longer you've been doing it and that you've been in that model, the harder it is to change. And, as
Mm-hmm.
you said, the people that invite me in are self selecting. So maybe they have an openness to this.
Yeah.
But even still, it doesn't mean it's easy for us and,
Yeah.
for any of us. And it can be really hard to get up and admit you did something you regret, or,
Mm-hmm.
you made a bad decision. And yet, what I mean, this is what I have seen. I think employees really respect a leader who can get up and share a mistake and
Yeah.
go like, that's the leader I want to work for. I don't want
Yeah.
to work for Mr. or Ms. Perfect, right? I want to work for the real human being
Mm-hmm.
who can share their strengths and share their weaknesses and know that we're all going to learn and do better together. Like, that's the leader I want to work for. But
Yeah.
it's a little bit of a lift for many people.
Yeah. And I mean, you hear sometimes people use the word, humanizes you,
Mm-hmm.
which I mean, I don't think anyone thought their leader was a robot, but it, we're human. We all make mistakes, whether we admit it or not. So I think humanizing is a different word. I think vulnerable is a different
Mm-hmm.
word that sometimes doesn't land well. People are like, I don't
Yes.
want to be vulnerable because they think that means weak. Where like one thing I'll credit Tim Clark, author of the 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, for helping me understand that vulnerable really means that you're exposed to some sort of risk of harm
Yes.
due to external reactions. That's not you're not. It doesn't mean you're bad to be vulnerable. It means you're in an environment of risk, and that's unfortunate to be in that risk environment, right? We want leaders to reduce the risk of speaking up.
Yeah, and I think there are also misunderstandings about vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
because often when you say this to a leader, and it's just this general thing like, you need to be more vulnerable. Well, what does that mean? And people miss it. I've seen
Right.
leaders go so far wrong into interpreting that to mean I need to bare my soul and share my like horrible secrets,
Yeah.
and it so misfires, right? It just backfires completely. And so, yeah, vulnerable does not mean sharing everything or oversharing,
Right.
and it also doesn't mean showing your soft underbelly that, may really expose you beyond your comfort zone. But
Mm-hmm.
it's like, just, I do like the word humanize. And in fact, the subtitle
Mm-hmm.
of our playbook is Lead More Powerfully by Being More Human,
Yeah,
because we really do believe that you
that's right.
will be a stronger, more powerful leader if you can show up as that imperfect, perfectly imperfect human being that we all are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I think the word candid or candor
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, if we say we hope we have an environment where everybody can be candid, like to me that's a more positive word that we could aspire to. I'm curious your thoughts on candor as
Yeah, and I really like Kim Scott's work on radical candor and
yeah.
her new book, Radical Respect. I really like and respect her work on that, because it's true. Like, in a way, like if you asked me to define psychological safety, and you could actually define it in a way that psychological safety is the enabler of candor in
Mm-hmm.
some
Yeah.
ways, right? I mean, because that's what it is. It enables us to tell the truth, and I think we do have to, have a little caveat. It doesn't mean we get to be, what's the expression, brutally honest. Like, people say I'm going to be brutally honest, and I just brace myself, right, for
Right.
that dagger to the heart. Like,
Yeah.
no, there's no need to be brutal. We can be
Right.
respectful,
Yes.
we can be kind, and we can tell the truth and
Yeah.
have candor, and we can care about the other person's well-being, and that we're not going to destroy them. We want us all to be better. Like, that's the reason
Mm-hmm.
for candor, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's misunderstandings or misinterpretations of a word like vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about, like, people hear the phrase psychological safety.
Yep.
So there was an article. I'm going to read the headline to you, and I'm curious how you answer the question. I think it was an HBR. I'll try to pull it up in the show notes, but I'm pretty sure the headline off memory was, "Can you have too much psychological safety?"
I remember that article. Yeah, I think it was. I think I have a link to it somewhere too,
Yeah.
because I saved it. And I feel like I mean, I don't remember the article itself. I remember the headline, but what I actually think is that the premise of that is a misunderstanding.
I
The
thought so.
premise is that no, you probably can't have too much psychological safety. What you can have is a misunderstanding of what it is. And,
Mm-hmm.
the misunderstandings around psychological safety are that it's an anything goes environment, there's no
Right.
accountability,
Right.
it's all kumbaya and feel good all the time. And that is just simply a misinterpretation. I mean, it can be deeply uncomfortable still, and
Mm-hmm.
we don't all agree, and it's not an anything goes. We still hold people accountable, we still have performance standards and metrics and all of those things, but we
Right.
can talk about them in an open way. And so I don't think you can have too much. I think it's an enabler of all good things.
Mm-hmm.
And we just must not misinterpret that it's like, oh, we get to be lazy. And, the other thing I've heard, and this is, I've heard from leaders who are like, I'm really struggling because I have employees, and they've used the term like who are weaponizing psychological safety. And
What?
it's again the misinterpretation. They're saying things like, oh, when you gave me that constructive feedback, I didn't feel safe.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
then they're feeling like, now what do I do? I'm walking on
Right.
eggshells. And this is not
I,
what this is about. We should not be walking on eggshells in a
yeah.
safe environment.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're misinterpreting, or they're confusing safety with comfort.
Exactly. And these are not the same things at all.
Right.
Right. And, I mean, obviously the term psychological safety dates back to decades ago. And I
Mm-hmm.
forget the original authors of a paper on it, but I wish the term were something else. But now
Yeah.
that it's in the vernacular,
Yeah.
and the reason is, I have actually heard resistance from leaders who say, like, I like the concept, but please do not use the term psychological safety. And the reasons behind that are multifold, but I think part of it is just even the psychological.
Uh-huh.
It feels like we're doing therapy of some kind, which we're
Right.
not.
Or
And
what's wrong
then,
with you? And that's,
yeah, and it feels touchy feely to
yeah.
some leaders. And,
Yeah.
oh, well, that's the term we have. But I
Yeah.
think we need to be clear and not misinterpret it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And like, to me, so the phrase psychological safety should not be used to shut down discussion.
Exactly.
I've heard that kind of tangentially of, yeah, stop disagreeing because, psychological safety. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like,
Right.
I mean, like, with candor and respect, and psychological safety means I could disagree with you, and then you could disagree back
Exactly.
in a
Exactly.
way, that's, hopefully focused on common goals, and trying to reach the best solution.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think the key, this is a key that I write about, is that in that we can absolutely disagree, and we need to disagree. That's how we get to new ideas. However, there's a piece in the middle that's so important, is that we listen to each other.
Yeah.
That we're willing to listen to divergent perspectives, disagreeing perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
to the end of reaching the best solution or decision. And, what I found, unfortunately, so common is that we're talking at cross purposes, and we're just really preparing our rebuttal instead of really listening to what the other person is saying. And we immediately close our minds to the other person. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of the things that I firmly believe, that a strong leader is willing to change their mind based on new information.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure. Yeah.
Not dig in their heels and say, I
No.
can't, I would be weak if I changed my mind here.
Yeah. No, I mean, in politics, that gets derisively called a flip flop. And,
Right.
I've had two members of Congress on the podcast. One of them, Adam Smith from Washington State, really dug into that conversation about, like, why, something you feel like you're going to be attacked for doing exactly what you described. I changed my mind based on new
Right.
information. That should be admirable.
Exactly. I know. And I was like, here's a piece of mentoring I once got from a guy I reported to. He gave me some feedback saying, you initially said X, and then after we had that meeting, you said Y. That's actually something you need to work on, because and I was like, oh, the lesson I've taken away is, like, he's an idiot. I actually learned something and changed my mind. Okay, I shouldn't call him an idiot. That is very judgmental. But you
It's
know
a
what I mean,
feeling.
right? Like,
It's
I
a
just
feeling. No.
disregarded
Yeah. Yeah.
I disregarded that feedback because it felt
Yeah.
wrong to me.
Right. Yeah. And, it makes me think, over time, if organizations are punishing the people who admit mistakes, change their minds, say whether they were wrong, say, honestly, I don't know, but let's go
Yes.
find out, like, and if the organization is then promoting the people who create this facade of perfection. Like that's not complicated system dynamics to think of how that could spiral out of control over time. And where, a company that was really successful for a period, we wonder, how do companies fall into decline? It could be that, among other factors. You might be described on the surface as like, oh, they stopped innovating. Like, well,
Right.
why?
Right.
It could be that, right?
It could very well be that. And, I've seen that. It's that I'd rather be right than learn something new kind of thing. And yeah, it's, and, even that situation where that leader got defensive with me and embarrassed me and everyone, but really, like, I replayed that so many times, and I actually workshop this when I do work with people. It's like, tell that story. How could it be different? And how do I model this? Like, when I'm running a workshop and someone asks me a question, I pause. First of all, the pause is really important. I think for a moment, how do I want to respond? Maybe I do have an answer. Maybe it took me a moment to think about it. But maybe what I say is, I really don't have an answer to that question. I will come back to you as I get more. And I'd also love to open it up to the room to see if someone else has that information when you're in a group. Like, if that could have played out in that way, then that CEO could have set the tone of like, oh, you really can ask anything in this room. And then the next hand would have gone up, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh, wow. So another question, Minette, if leaders are really interested in trying to help cultivate psychological safety, how can they understand how safe people truly feel within an organization, within their team of direct reports, yet alone, the whole org chart?
Right. Well, I mean, let's just start with like their direct reports. You could certainly, and I know many organizations do surveys and things like this. One of the things I got a certification in is running psychological safety assessments. So you can do that. I would say even before you do that, you can probably have a high level assessment if you do one thing, and that is you pay attention to how meetings transpire in your, like, let's say it's your direct reports and you have a regular staff meeting. Now just observe who does most of the talking, who stays silent, how many debates and disagreements do you have, how many like really new ideas are being shared, or is it more like everyone's nodding, people agree with the most senior person in the room, people say, yeah, good idea, and move out. Like, you as a leader will have an inkling if you even just watch the meeting dynamics. I think meetings are sort of, they embody our team cultures and they reveal our team cultures if you pay attention. And that's why I really recommend being deliberate in how we run meetings. So I think that's the first inkling a leader can get. And then I think they should do some surveying and find out. And then they need to dig a little deeper. And, I think the other thing is, even without doing the surveying, you can just start to work on the things that will move the needle, without data. But it can be helpful. I think it's often, a lot of people want data, and so I think run a survey. Whether you bring in someone like who's certified in this, or you just add it to your pulse surveys, like have a few questions. And in fact, like, if you want the easy way out, in Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization, she has a set of questions that you can use in your own surveys. And I often recommend run those, see how people are feeling, and then go deeper and start to do some of the work, and then measure it again in another quarter or whatever.
Yeah. And in between, and there's a whole playbook I'll point people to, but there's a playbook that I think it's fair. It goes back to leadership behaviors of not trying to mandate, hey, we're safe now, you should speak up, we're going to start speaking up. Really comes down to leadership, right?
Yeah. And in fact, it's so common for people to say, this is a safe environment, say what's on your mind. And no one believes that, right? Because they don't have evidence that it's true. So it really does come back down to, how do you first of all, invite perspective. So it comes down to that behavior, like, what are we missing? What am I missing? Whose voice haven't we heard? So really inviting. And then how do we respond? Do we actually listen with curiosity and not defensiveness? And, all of those things. Do we yes and instead of saying, no, we've already tried that, it'll never work, right? So all of those behaviors. And in fact, the reason Carolyn Helbig and I wrote this playbook is there is a wealth of information about why psychological safety is important, from Amy Edmondson and Tim Clark's stages. And so for us, what was missing was the how-to. Like, what do I do now? And that's why we wrote this book. And I think you can jump in no matter what level you are in leadership and no matter how much experience you have with this topic, because it's really just small changes that can have a hugely powerful, positive impact.
Yeah. And thank you for mentioning Carolyn. I neglected to mention the name of your co-author. And do I remember right? She's German?
Yeah, she's German. In fact, I'm heading out this week to meet her. We're going on a little speaking tour in Germany and Denmark to talk about the book.
So that leads to my next question of how universal are these concepts?
So first of all, they seem to be very universal. However, there are cultural differences. And so I think you can probably say that every human being wants to be able to have a voice. And some of that is really just our biology that we need to, sorry, I'm going to make a little bit of a side tour and come back for a moment.
Sure.
And this is where I link psychological safety to inclusion, because I think it's so important, right? So when we feel included, we feel that we are accepted and respected and welcome for who we are. And that is an innate human need. And our biology really, that's how we've been designed, but also our brains register pain when we don't have that. That absence of inclusion lights up as pain. The neuroscientists have studied this, and it's so interesting. And psychological safety is so closely linked to that, as if I do not feel heard and respected, I'm not feeling well, I'm feeling pain. And so this is human nature, and this goes across cultures. What's different, and this is how well does it translate, to come back to your question, is that in different cultures, it shows up in very different ways. And so, for example, when you're dealing with a highly hierarchical culture, like some of the Asian cultures, for example, you cannot easily challenge your leader. Because that is just not done.
Right.
So whereas in more of a Western culture, that is more acceptable. I mean, it's still hard. It's not to say that it's easy. But I remember working with a leader. He was working in a multinational organization, but he's Indian and based in India. And we were talking about psychological safety. He said, Minette, so much of this is really hard where I am from, because I can't even get my staff members to use my first name instead of calling me Mr. So, right, it shows up in very different ways. And I think, one of the things I'm really interested in is how can we cultivate higher psychological safety in cultures where hierarchy is really strong and where, thousands of years of tradition are getting in the face of this, while knowing that we still want it as human beings and we still need it.
Yeah. And then there's cultural differences. And, as a final topic, I'm glad you started connecting the dots between these different topics and in your book. So I wanted to ask about demographic differences. And my observation, and something I've tried to get better at, is not assuming that my sense of psychological safety will be shared by others, yet alone people who are different than me. I've had some guests on this show kind of bring up the issue. I want to hear your thoughts on it. Is something I had not had to think about as straight white guy. Like, if I make a mistake and I admit a mistake, that might reflect on me. When I've had guests, for example, a Black woman who expresses the feeling of, well, it might reflect badly on others who are like me. And that's a level of burden that I think that's the definition of privilege.
Totally.
That I don't face that. What are your thoughts on demographic differences?
There are definitely differences. And it's, you see it, like, so you just said, like, I have the privilege of being a white straight male, and I have okay. And so for me, definitely what I notice is like less psychological safety than my white male cisgendered straight counterparts, even as a white female straight cisgendered woman. And then you bring in all of the other aspects of diversity, and you do talk about race, and it's true. And in fact, like, your guest was absolutely right that is like, there's this burden. So am I speaking on behalf of all women? Am I going to make women look bad if I say something that seems stupid? And then as a Black woman, a Latina woman, whatever, Asian woman. And in fact, it's the McKinsey Lean In State of Work Women in the Workplace report that comes out every year. They actually brought that up. The data showed, and it was about psychological safety, that women of color have a lower level than women, and women in general have a lower level than men. So I think there's good data to back it up, and it is problematic. It is problematic. So we can't, it's not one size fits all. It's that as I said, like it's the team dynamic, but it's also what we each bring to it.
Right. Right. And it would be a huge mistake for someone to look at that data and to blame Black women or any group for that. That misses the point altogether.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. No, I mean, it's just like, look at the history we have been through, right? And what people have had to deal with and are still dealing with day in, day out. And, we didn't even get into things like microaggressions, which are anything but micro, but the kinds of things that women are dealing with, women of color are dealing with, people of color are dealing with. And, and it goes beyond race and gender. It goes into, neurodiversity and all the other aspects of diversity. I would just basically say anyone who feels they are not part of the majority dominant group is experiencing, feelings of exclusion, lesser psychological safety, and that they need to work that much harder to feel like they fit in and they really are welcome and that they belong.
That's very well said, Minette. So I want to thank, again, our guest today, Minette Norman. I joked before we started recording, like, there's going to be a 5-hour episode because there's so much I want to pick your brain about. Minette is co-author with Carolyn Helbig, the Psychological Safety Playbook, Lead More Powerfully by Being More Human. I've got it on my iPad. I'm going to try to hold up here. I'm most of the way through. I've been really enjoying the book. And to your point, the other books on psychological safety are great, but I appreciate the practical playbook nature of the book. So I encourage people to check that out. Continue deepening our understanding of psychological safety. And then the second book, and it's been out. Both books have been out about a year, right? The Boldly Inclusive Leader is the other book. Transform Your Workplace and the World by Valuing the Differences Within. Was it a mistake to have two books launched at right about the same time? That's unusual, right?
Well, it wasn't really the plan. The plan was I was working on the Boldly Inclusive Leader for many years. I was working on it still when I was in tech. And then I met Carolyn in a class in 2021 on running these psychological safety assessments. And we took this detour to write the playbook. And then I finished the Boldly Inclusive Leader. So I had actually signed a contract for the Boldly Inclusive Leader before Carolyn and I wrote our book. So I would not advise any author to have two books coming out the same year. But hey, now they're out. Now I'm just enjoying, speaking on both of them.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'll make sure there's a link to Minette's website in the show notes, and any lifespan of life cycle of a book is a marathon, not a sprint. So thank you for coming on the podcast and being able to talk about both books and sharing your thoughts and experiences and connecting the dots on those important topics. So Minette, thank you again so much.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, we'll continue for another 4 hours offline.
Thanks again.